Hello and welcome to another European report here in the European Parliament in Brussels. In today's programme we're going to discuss the Council of Europe's decree to try and ban male circumcision. We'll also be discussing Iran's new President Rouhani, and as talks are opening in Geneva, we're saying what is the prospects of Europe succeeding in preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And our final issue in today's programme, we'll be talking about how the US has decided to suspend military and financial aid to Egypt, and what impact will this have on Egypt, and certainly what impact will this have on EU relations with Egypt. So welcome to the European report. My guests are Thomas Sandel from the European Coalition for Israel and Andrew Tucker, also from the Coalition for Israel. And it's a great privilege to have Marek Sinovic on the programme today. Marek, can you share a little bit about your background, how you got involved in politics and your role here within the European Parliament?
You know, I only look so young, but really I'm approaching 60. If you want to know how I came to politics, it took us a really long time. But speaking briefly, the politics is something what you have inside or you don't have inside. There is nothing between. So since the beginning I knew that I have this something inside. So being a journalist, being a member of parliament, being the official in Polish administration, I came to European Parliament, so it was a very logic way through the media and the student union and so on and so on. So, and if somebody doesn't know whether he has this feature inside or not, the easiest way is to stand in front of camera. If the wings are, you spread your wings, it means you have this something inside. If your wings are like that, you don't have this.
That's a good litmus test. And also there's a big game tonight, isn't there? It's England versus Poland in the World Cup qualifiers. So our two nations are really...
We are losers in the beginning, so this is only to present that still we are, as a country, the time of big success of Polish football, soccer is finished. Unfortunately, this time has finished when we were out of the professional football community, and the people who really built the position of Poland, they couldn't consume the success in terms of personal career, financial career. So now we have people who have a lot of money, who are playing football, but they don't know how to play. So really I'm not very much happy that we are playing, having no chance to go to World Cup. So that's why I'm not as happy as you are, being English probably.
And Andrew, we know that Holland have already qualified quite easily, so they'll be in Brazil next year. But Andrew, can you share some of the works that you've been doing on behalf of the European Coalition for Israel and also your organisation, Christians for Israel?
Well, as an international lawyer, one of the things I've been involved with for the coalition particularly is this whole issue of the settlements and Jerusalem. We're very focused on this issue. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there about the settlements, Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, the peace process. So we've been very active and still are active, especially as Europe is implementing guidelines to withdraw funding European funding from the settlements beyond the Green Line. We want people to understand a little bit more what the settlements are, who the settlers are, and actually that this whole issue, the Jewish people belong in the West Bank because they will bring a blessing and prosperity to other people in the region. And if we divide these people and we build fences between these people, we're going to tear apart something which has been built up over the years and which is very, very beneficial to many people.
And Thomas, I know that you've had a busy month last month visiting the UN General Assembly in New York. So can you share with us some of your experiences and some of the things you've been involved in, particularly with the UN?
Well, thank you, Simon. It's good to be on the program again, and I can sympathize with Marek Sivik when it comes to football. Finns have never qualified ever in the final round of the World Championship, so we feel pretty much left out. And I admire the British and the Netherlands who have been able to have such a successful track record. true. 2 weeks ago we were in New York for the opening session of the 68th General Assembly, and basically we had two messages that we were conveying to the governments and the UN missions in New York. One had to do with Rouhani and his charm offensive, and I know we'll be discussing that more in depth later in the program. Of course, we are skeptical, and I think we have good reasons to be skeptical. Secondly, we are trying to galvanize more support for Israel also on the UN level. And there was a very practical initiative that we were presenting together with the Israelis, and that was that the United Nations should honor Yom Kippur in the same way as the Christian holidays and the Muslim holidays are respected in the UN system. And I think it would be appropriate that you would not organize important meetings on this, the most holy of the high holidays in Judaism. In a similar way as I'm sure Marek Civic would not be keen to have a session here in the European Parliament on Christmas Day, regardless of faith or level of commitment. So this is something very concrete and practical, where I believe we are looking at a common denominator with all the UN member states to say, let's be reasonable, let's treat the Jewish people, the Israelis, in the same way that all the other 193 member states are being treated and respected.
By the way, as you know, in Parliament, the agenda of European Parliament was moved because of Orthodox Easter. So I absolutely agree that this should be general rule, that the religion which is present in European culture is respected by the others. It's not a question of the figures, it's a question of the basic rule.
Thomas, I want to bring you on the first issue today, which is a very important issue, particularly affecting the Jewish people across Europe. And this is the Council of Europe's decree to propose the banning of male circumcision. I'll just read a quote, this one. So, what do you make of the Council of Europe's decree to propose outlawing male religious circumcision across the 47 member states that totals 47 nations in total? This is what the decree says. The Council of Europe wants to initiate public debate, including intercultural and interreligious dialogue, aimed at reaching a large consensus on the rights to protect children against violations of their physical integrity according to human rights standards. Eventually, it would like member states to go further than just a debate and adopt specific legal provisions to ensure certain operations practice will not be carried out before a child is old enough to be consulted. What do you make of this decree, and what impact do you think this will have on the Jewish community in Europe, knowing that circumcision is absolutely central to the practice of Judaism?
Well, first of all, I'd like to make two clarifications, and I think this is also to honor our colleague in the panel. This is not the European Parliament, it's not an institution of the European Union. So the Council of Europe, as you may recall, was established already in 1949. It's located in Strasbourg, but there are no connection with the European Union, so let's make this point clear. Also, the fact that the Council of Europe cannot make decrees, they cannot make binding law, but this is simply a recommendation. Nevertheless, being a recommendation which was accepted with a huge majority, I think we're looking at 49 versus 13, it does leave a feeling in Europe among the Jewish communities looking at the future. Is there really a future for Jewish life in Europe? As you rightly said, that circumcision is such a central procedure in Judaism, and can you really be a full-fledged Jew in Europe and not practicing circumcision? So if you would to be a little bit to oversimplify, you may even say that which Hitler was not able to achieve through his means could be achieved on paper. That would make Jewish life in Europe impossible. Again, to make just the final point to say, this is a recommendation. I don't think any member state will implement it. I don't see that happening. But nevertheless, the fact that it had an overwhelming majority in the Council of Europe should be a worrying sign.
First of all, I don't like schizophrenia in politics. And if I read that the Council of Europe is calling to dialogue between medical doctors and religious representatives, it's something unbelievable. I'm basically against mixing politics with the religious issues, because it is not effective. I can imagine, let's imagine ourselves that the Council of Europe is calling to use a special kind of water, hygienic water, for baptism. Why? Because of hygienic reasons. We don't know what small children is baptized, with cold water, or which is not checked by the authorities. This would be something unbelievable, and this is the same. This is more or less the same. And we have two issues. The first, which are now again on the agenda, this is religious slaughter, which came, for example, in Poland as the issue in a very stupid way. And the Jewish community has a good right to ask why again, because it comes normally when somebody want to punish the Jewish population. This religious slaughter comes as the issue, or I don't know this word, the male circumcision. Yeah. So I am of course, I respect the answer of Mr. Jagland, who answered President Perez that this is only indication, But really, I'm basically against such events, because even if there is any goodwill, I believe there is some goodwill, the output is terrible. Only one comment to this, what you said. I wouldn't put Adolf Hitler, on the same level like Council of Europe, because this is, let's say, slightly different issue. But definitely, being non-Jewish, I don't feel comfortable reading such a stupid explanation of this, what these guys in Council of Europe are doing. Sometimes I have the impression that this institution as the whole is desperately looking for the job in Europe. Of course, I respect the bridges between Eastern countries. I respect the human rights as a general set of issues, but if this is the explanation of how they fight for human rights, I'm basically against.
So Marek, what can you do as a leading MEP here in the European Parliament to kind of protect religious freedom and religious practice? Knowing that
what should I do vis-à-vis this?
Absolutely,
this case?
absolutely.
Only this, because politically this is out of any space of dialogue. How to discuss with the people who do not understand what is religion? I'm not a very religious person, but I respect the people who are religious, and I'm ready to fight for their right to execute or to perform religious things as in the way how they decide. And I have no right, no obligation, being politician, to tell them how they should correct 1,000 years and the faith of God. This is totally out of sense. So I think we should also, being European, being citizens, we should also be critical vis-à-vis these issues, because if we accept that one day majority, even 78 versus 13, decide something about my life, I am against this procedure, especially if it is in the area of the region. So I hope that European Parliament will never never have such a discussion, and I believe that European Parliament will never invade the freedom of people who want to feel comfortable in Europe.
And Andrew, this is such an important issue, because the Jewish community across Europe already feel under siege with the rise of anti-Semitism, and now this proposal, this decree being outlined by the Council of Europe actually poses a direct threat to the practice of Judaism in Europe. And if this does get implemented, this could have serious repercussions for the future of the Jewish community here in Europe.
Well, I thank Marek for raising the point. We're not going to see this being implemented today or tomorrow, but it's a sign, really, isn't it, of a process. you know, this really touches the very heart of the Jewish people. And I think this is what makes this so very powerful. Is that circumcision goes really to the heart of the nature of the Jewish people, and that is the relationship with God. And what people you know, don't seem to understand and seem to want to understand is that the Jewish people, what makes them Jewish, what makes their whole identity is their relationship with God, which is expressed through the circumcision. And it's their submission to God and His ordinances and His will. So this is going to the heart of the Jewish people, which is why I think it really raises such feelings of mistrust in the Jewish people. And they're wondering to themselves, do we belong anymore in Europe? Is this the kind of Europe that we can live in and exist in as people?
And Thomas, we've seen in recent years, it's not really just the Jewish community is affected by this. The Muslim community is also affected by this one as well. And really, aren't we seeing a kind of emergence of a new political force, which is kind of militant secularism, saying there is no room for God, there's no room for any religious practices in Europe. And surely that goes against our entire fundamental rights and human rights.
You're absolutely right. Marek Civic had to leave for a vote here in the European Parliament. I'd be thrilled to discuss the initiator of this recommendation, the Council of Europe, because I don't think it was just an accident that it was a social democrat who raised the issue. He may disagree because he represents the social democrats in this European Parliament. But you have on the one hand, I would say, a mostly left-wing, but not entirely, very radical secular segment in political life. All of a sudden finding a common project with the right-wing extremists and I would say racists. Of course, their motivations are slightly different. I think I usually use this word soft anti-Semitism, sophisticated anti-Semitism, which is more difficult to track down than you know, right-wing racism, skinhead extremism. And a typical argument on this sophisticated sort of, call it liberal side of anti-Semitism is that you want to protect something. So it's human rights against religious freedom. And we have a number of cases in the Nordic countries where they would say whenever there's a conflict between human rights and religious freedom, it's human rights that will have to prevail. So here they see infants, you know, the rights of a baby being infringed. That you know, they should have a say when they're eight days old whether they like circumcision or not. And I think that Marek made a very good point in saying, I never thought of this myself, that we never had a debate of baptism water to say, well, you know, I'm sure there are implications also there. Is it a traumatic experience for a child to have this cold water splashed over your face? Because, you know, often they cry, right? Or you know, could there be medical implications in, you know, should we check the baptism water? We never, ever had that debate. So I think, again, you know, picking on religious groups and in particular Jews who are a minority is a worrying sign, which is then uniting again these forces who are outright against any expression of Jewish life in Europe. But then on the other hand, which is more difficult to deal with, you have people who will say, no, this is you know, we are for religious freedom, we are for minority rights, but this is a human rights issue. And I think that's a debate that we have to take on, to say, well, is it really a human rights issue? And if so, what are the wider implications?
Absolutely. And Andrew, I just want to quote from a scripture here. It says, the issue of circumcision dates back to the Bible, which is over 4,000 years old. From Genesis chapter 7, verses 9 to 14, when God spoke to Abraham, that's what it says. Then God said to Abraham, as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you for all generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall also undergo circumcision. It will be a sign of the covenant between me and you. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or brought with money from a foreigner, or those who are not your offspring. Whether born in your household or brought with your money, they must be circumcised. My covenant is your flesh, to be an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And Jews, as we said in the scripture, perform circumcision on the 8th day, known as the Brit Milah in Hebrew, which has been observed by the Jewish people for over 4,000 years. And yet some European bureaucrats believe that they want the right to define this Jewish practice as the dark side of Judaism and labelling it a violation of human rights. Yeah. Surely this is doing nothing to promote religious harmony and religious practice, and actually undermines the whole concept of tradition and freedom of right, and clearly affects the Jewish community.
Yeah. It definitely does. One of the things that amazes me is, why pick on this issue? Why I can understand, female mutilation in female circumcision, but you can't compare male circumcision with female circumcision. And this is one of the things that Israeli President Peres was emphasizing in his letter to the Council of Europe. He's saying there's no medical reason here for being concerned. Of course, there are circumstances of Jewish children even dying on the circumcision table because of malpractice. The use of blunt instruments or instruments which bring disease or whatever. Of course, there should be regulations for that. But to attack the fact, the practice of circumcision itself, is absurd. What about the millions and millions of abortions going on throughout Europe every year? Who's standing up for the rights of those unborn children? So we see a fundamental conflict between so-called human rights, the freedom of expression, the freedom to determine your own well-being, and the freedom of religion. Now, it goes to the very heart of this idea of covenant, I think. This is really, I think, what offends people, is that there's some covenant between God and the Jewish people. How can the Jewish people be so arrogant as to say they have a special covenant with God? This offends us. It even offends many Christians, because we think we now have the covenant with God, and the circumcision, that's something for the Old Testament, that's something for the past. We need to realize that the Jewish people still have a covenant relationship with God the Father. And that hasn't been replaced by the church, it hasn't been replaced by the Council of Europe or anybody else. It's still there. And that's why I think this is so powerful, because it's the failure to respect that covenant relationship which I think is bringing about the collapse of Europe as we really know it. Europe based on fundamental values, not just human rights, but values. And those values we owe to the Jewish people and their covenant with God. So to attack circumcision is in a way to attack the very root of our Christian identity, I think.
I'll just come in with one additional observation. I think if you're pragmatic and want to find something good coming out of this whole discussion, I think you can find good points. Well, first of all, Council of Europe is an organization you never ever hear about, hardly. When did you hear about a recommendation from the Council of Europe, last time? And I think the fact that we have this discussion is a good opportunity for us to really draw the red line and say, well, there are certain things which are non-negotiables. But also, I think very pragmatically, this is an issue which does not only affect the Jewish community, it affects the Muslim communities just as much. And I think we need to find these issues which unites the minority communities, faith communities in Europe. So what you can see here, of course, is a coalition of Christians being concerned but just as much, Muslim communities saying this is not acceptable, together with the Jewish communities. So there are not always too many issues that would unite Christians and Muslims and Jews in a way that this particular issue has the capacity to do. So that's why I said initially that I just don't see this becoming law in any EU member state, not for the next 5-10 years. But I think it's a worrying sign enough that we have this discussion, and even in a discussion when you then have a roll call, that there's an overwhelming majority for just accepting this nonsense. In that same sentence where you mentioned it's genital mutilation, male circumcision, and then it mentions tattoos and piercing in the same sentence. So what a disgrace to compare religious expression of the covenant with God with piercing or tattooing of small children. I think it's disgraceful, and it's our duty to say so.
And the next issue we're going to talk is the renewed negotiations between the Iranians and the 5+1 members of the UN Security Council to discuss Iran's nuclear weapons program. Thomas, I want to bring you on this one. This week marks the start of the P5+1 talks in Geneva this week, which includes the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which are the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom and France, plus Germany. But since Rouhani won the presidential elections in June, there has certainly been a change of approach and a change of tone by the new Iranian government. Has their rhetoric matched up with their words in terms of them freezing their nuclear enrichment program?
No, absolutely not. And this is something which was crystal clear during the week in New York. The charm offensive of Rouhani was simply words, soft words, nice words, charming words, a diplomatic vocabulary which Ahmadinejad certainly did not have. Yeah. So in a way it was easier to understand and deal with Ahmadinejad than with Rouhani. And time will tell how long this period of diplomatic efforts and charm offensive and smiles will continue, and when the international community will demand to see concrete steps. Again, as I said earlier on this program, I believe this is an effort to buy time, knowing that if you change the rhetoric, you will buy months, maybe half a year, maybe a year. My concern is, of course, by the time that this diplomatic process has been tried successfully or unsuccessfully, it will be too late to stop the Iranians. When I say successfully, I can see a scenario where there would be some concessions, but I think those concessions would be, just on the surface, nothing substantial. I just don't see the Iranian regime backing off their ambitions, nuclear ambitions. There are no indication, at least in Farsi, that they would have any indication of doing so. And I think again it's a double talk when you look what is being communicated in Tehran and what is being communicated in New York. It's clearly a double talk, and I would wish that the international community would be clever enough to see this. I made the comparison. Of course, one should always be careful in making comparison with 1938, but I think, again, we have to keep in mind what happened in 1938 when the whole world wanted to hear peace, and even knowing that the man at that time who said, this will create peace, once you give us a little piece of Czechoslovakia, this will be it. It did not bring peace, it did bring destruction. So I think we should learn from history and be on our guard to be alert.
Neville Chamberlain, peace in our time. So we know how he's gone down in the history books now. Yeah. Andrew, the basis of negotiation, essentially, particularly that Iran is a rogue regime, Iran is the leading state sponsor of international terrorism, a terrible abuser of human rights against Christians, against the Jewish community, also against Baha'is and other religious minorities. It's run by a kind of theological extreme Islamist dictatorship. And yet here the West is engaging and wanting to engage in these negotiations, and yet there seems to be nothing on the ground. So do you believe that we should be having talks with the new Iranian face of the regime in President Rouhani, or should the West wait to see action on the ground before we enter into talks?
Oh, well, it's a difficult one. I'm not a political analyst in that sense, but you know, I think we have to understand and accept at the background the nature of this regime. You know, I think Thomas is absolutely right. We are dealing with a regime, and whoever is the face of that regime doesn't alter the true nature of it. It's that extremist Islamic Shiite philosophy which has an agenda, and that doesn't change simply because there's a more or less moderate or apparently moderate leader in place. I mean, I think talking is always good. You know, we're in a difficult place at the moment. We've realised that interventionism in the form of Iraq, Afghanistan, you know, is not working. It hasn't worked. America is no longer in a position where they can play the hard line and people will sit up and listen to them. We've seen it in Syria. You know, do we or do we not intervene? Nobody really knows the answer. And we face the same dilemma, I think, in relation to Iran, which makes us want to accommodate the regime and think that if we talk long enough, then they'll come around to our way of thinking. The reality is that they won't, and I think we need to take Netanyahu's words very seriously. And perhaps in contrast to Obama's words in relation to Syria, you know, there really is a red line here which is being crossed. And you put nuclear arms in the hands of people who are committed ideologically to the destruction of the Jewish people, we've crossed a line we can never, ever, and should never, ever do. And Hitler was definitely an example, but there are other examples in history as well of people who've had that agenda. So I think we have a real serious issue on our hands here. But the problem is, you know, who has the power? Who has the equipment to stand up to these people? America doesn't have it anymore. Russia doesn't want to do it. China's taking a back step. And it's very interesting that Germany is playing a role here. Of all countries in the world, they're taking a leading role here. So I think we ought to look very seriously at Germany, and through Germany, the role that Europe is playing in relation to Iran.
I mean, Thomas, we've got a scenario here where we're seeing what I can only describe as incredibly weak leadership by the US administration. And particularly the Iranians will take note of Obama's red lines when it comes to the use of chemical and biological weapons in Syria by Assad's regime, saying that, look, America's a paper tiger. You know, there's no threats. Obama wants to pursue the charm offensive with Rouhani. He wants to be seen as the kind of peacemaker. That's why I had that telephone call with Rouhani at the UN security after he was leaving the UN General Assembly last month. So all the indications are with the Iranians that all they have to do is to enter into talks, continue to speed up the enrichment of uranium that produces nuclear weapons, and also encourage the West to drop the sanctions and ease up on the sanctions because, hey, we've got a new face. But isn't the great danger here that the West is being swept up in deception? And we could actually pay the consequences because it's not only Israel, but it's also the Saudis and the Gulf states who are very, very concerned about Iran's march towards nuclear weapons.
Yeah. I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, Roosevelt who said, talk softly, carry a big stick. I think the problem with the US right now is they do talk softly, but they don't carry a big stick anymore. And the international community sees this. It's very clear. I don't blame the US president or the American people. They've suffered through so many wars. It's ruining their economy. But it's putting the world situation in a more difficult position or situation. In this context, I'd like to say something very positive of the chief representative of the EU foreign policy, Catherine Ashton. because she did make a declaration the day after Rouhani had spoken in New York to say, listen, words are not enough. We cannot lift the sanctions yet. And here we have a debate, of course, within the European Union. And I think your country, Simon, with the Foreign Secretary Haig, has made some first steps in normalizing the relations with Tehran, which I don't believe are helpful. Whereas this time you hear Baroness Ashton, who usually would be a person to dialogue and believe the most positive things about the Iranians, who is rather resilient in saying, listen, this is not the time to lift the sanctions. And I think this is our message. This should be the message of the European Union to say, let's press on with the sanctions. They are working. And this is why Rouhani, I believe, is so desperate, because he sees that if the sanctions will continue much longer, this may be the end of their regime. This may trigger an uprising in Tehran. So that's why I'm so concerned that at this point we are going into on a track which does not seem to lead anywhere, but just to buy time, and the worst case scenario also lifting of sanctions, which would really be counterproductive at this point.
Yeah. And Angie, I just want to quote from the Israeli Prime Minister, who's very much gone on to the European press in recent days to warn European public opinion about the need to keep sanctions in place. This is what he said. He says the Iranian regime is currently smiling and saying, you know what, let me continue enriching uranium. Let me keep my plutonium plants. I will give you tactical concessions, cosmetic concessions, and I will ease your sanctions. He went on to say, but if the sanctions are eased, the sanctions will collapse. They'll get everything they want, and we collectively won't get anything, and we won't get anything. He says, but don't say I didn't warn you. The Jewish people have been around for 4,000 years. They tried to destroy us over and over, but they didn't succeed, and we won't let our people, like the Ayatollahs, succeed. It's important to stress that this isn't just an Israeli issue. This issue affects you. Why does it seem to be that it's only the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's really, really standing out against the Iranian threat?
Well, I think it's the last comment that he makes is perhaps the key one. He says this is not just about Israel, this is about you. And this is perhaps where I think we need to understand more and better why the existence of Iranian atomic weapons is going to affect Europe. It's not just a local Middle Eastern problem anymore, is it? And maybe in a way it's not just about the atomic weapons either. It's about the whole the desire and the philosophy behind the atomic weapons, which is affecting not just the Jewish people but Israel. The idea that they want to annihilate the Jewish people, but also the whole culture, Western culture, that has come out of the Jewish people. In a way, it's almost a comparison between what's happening with the male circumcision issue, with the atomic weapons issue. They're both an attack on some kind of basic value system which is at the heart of Europe, and maybe this is kind of the issue. Do we value those values enough to want to defend them and even to give our lives for them? Europe is so afraid of conflict now, so afraid of war. We don't like war, do we? None of us want war, but at the end of the day you have to be prepared to fight to overcome the threat, which is really threatening your very existence. I mean, my grandfather, for example, from Australia, fought in the First World War on the battlefields of Belgium. And I always asked myself as a child, why would an Australian want to fight and give his life in the fields of Flanders? Well, I know now that he was doing it because they were fighting for some very fundamental values and willing to give our lives for them. And in Europe, we've lost that sense, haven't we? That, there are certain things which we need to fight for and be willing to sacrifice for. And I think the Jewish people, the existence of the Jewish people and Israel is one of those things which is so fundamentally central to who we are and identity in Western civilization, that we must be prepared to go the whole mile on it.
Thomas, I'm going to say something controversial. I mean, I'm going off script here, but I met quite an incredible guy in Washington, D.C. His name's David Wurmser. He went on to become under the Bush administration, Dick Cheney's Middle East foreign policy advisor. And I remember meeting him in his office in '99, and he said something very interesting about war. He said that peace is not the natural condition of mankind. And what he meant by that is that it's actually through wars and conflicts that actually keeps a nation's value and a society's value system, because that's what they're fighting for. Do you think, in a sense, because Europeans and American civilians really haven't faced a war really since World War II, we've had acts of terrorism and other things, and our soldiers have been deployed around the world across from Europe, but the civilians themselves haven't been placed in a war footing, that we've actually become soft, and therefore we don't recognise evil when we see it, and therefore what we're seeing now is that it's peace at any price and a policy as appeasement that Europe's pursuing, the Americans pursuing, as we saw in the 1930s, and if we don't stand up to evil and terror, then it's more likely to overcome us.
Well, it's a controversial issue, and you know what is the role of war in Europe? I mean, it's clear that the European Union was founded on this dream of peace and reconciliation. I think we should be very grateful for the fact that we had this long period of no major wars. We should say major wars in Europe. We had the Balkans, but apart from that, it's been a peaceful period. And I think, by and large, of course, this is a great blessing. This is something we have to be thankful for every day. But it's true what you're saying. I think there is always a risk of giving up central values just to keep it this way. And I don't think that we have to go. It's not a question of going to war as much as it is a question of just being firm in our value system, as Andrew said. And I think what other cultures and civilizations and regions either respect or don't respect is this firmness. And they see that Europe, by and large, is losing that firmness, losing the values that they really want to stand up for at any price. And I think once we make this clear to say we are going to stand up for these values at any price, you know, the chances of having to pay a high price is not as probable as when you just let things slide, and all of a sudden you find yourself in the most terrible situation, when there's no other way out than, you know, finding military means. So as I said, I'm not ready to give you an answer to your to your question. I'm very happy for the European Union in this respect, what they provided. But we should also make clear, you know, the French and the Europeans, they were happy to go into Mali when they saw certain values were being crossed. And they sort of kept very quiet about it. You know, why did they all of a sudden send, you know, troops thousands and thousands of kilometers away from Paris? But why do they at the same time just sort of look at Israel and say, well, it's not our battle, it's not our issue? Because it was exactly the same threat in Mali as the Israelis are fighting, you know, every day. And as, again, I often quote Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar, who say, you know, Israel is part of the Western world. If Israel falls, you know, we all fall.
No, absolutely. And finally, to close on this issue, Thomas, according to a recent intelligence report that was quoted by the Times of Israel, in which the Israeli intelligence believed that the Iranian economy will collapse in 18 months, shouldn't the West just hold their nerve and actually hold out for social and political unrest in Iran that could actually be the trigger to lead to regime change?
Well, I would, again, phrase the question slightly different. Comparing how the European Union and the US is looking at the situation in Egypt and comparing that with the situation in Iran, I think historically over the last 5-10 years and today, there's a very different mentality. in Iran, they invested very little in encouraging the opposition, even when there was a chance of a pre-Arabic Spring with the uprising in Tehran. Obama was sitting on the fence. He said absolutely nothing, and neither did the Europeans. So I think what we should do is to identify the good forces in Iran, the opposition, those who want a different kind of regime, and support them strongly. Because, as I said earlier in the program, we see that the boycotts, the sanctions are having an effect. And this is the right time to not lift the sanctions, to continue with them, but at the same time be able to identify and help and empower those good groups that there are in Iran. And I think, from my understanding, if I compare the opposition in Iran, I see a clear alternative to the current regime, which we do not see in Syria at the moment. And it's difficult also in Egypt. And I think the fact that the European Union would have such a favorable perception of Morsi and wanting to sort of bring him back into the political game at any cost is a worrying sign. My question would be, rhetorical question would be, well, what are the European Union then doing in Iran?
Well, thank you for mentioning Egypt, because that's our next subject. We're going to be discussing the Obama administration's decision to suspend much of its military and financial aid to Egypt. Angie, I want to bring you on this one. What do you make of the news last week that the US has decided to suspend huge parts of its military aid to Egypt? That includes its delivery of tanks, 4 F-16 fighter jets, Apache helicopters, and also financial aid, primarily because of Obama's disapproval of the fact that the military overthrew President Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that 30 million Egyptians took to the streets all across Egypt to protest against the Islamicization of Egypt by the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, well, I mean, I fully understand the decision. It comes across to me as a little bit too little, too late. The Americans and Europe as well, we played a role as well in all of this over the last 30, 40 years. We were the ones who kept Mubarak in power. We were the ones who then enabled Morsi to come in and stood aside when things happened. So I don't think we have clean hands. America obviously has no choice but to withdraw its support also financially. I mean, they cannot keep up these kinds of contributions financially, let alone ideologically. But it's leaving, I think, a vacuum now we're seeing in Egypt. And the question will be, I think, what will Europe do? And what is the principle now behind, what regimes do we support and what don't we support? We're seeing, billions of dollars and euros going into the Palestinian Authority, for example, which is also supporting terrorism. There doesn't seem to be a clear principle which is emerging about what regimes do we support and what are the principles upon which we support them.
And Thomas, I mean, this is controversial in a way because the new military junta, the internship government, has come under General Sisi's overall control of what's happening in Egypt. The fact is that Morsi had marginalised 30 million Egyptians who did not want the Muslim Brotherhood in power to impose their will on the nation. By suspending this military aid, what kind of message is that sending out to the moderates, those who are the real champions for democracy, freedom and liberty in the Middle East? And also, what does this say about Egypt's ability to confront the rising threat of dangerous Islamist terrorist organisations in the Sinai, and also their ability to actually deal with some of these problems in Egypt?
I think, again, that I would disagree both with George W. Bush and the current administration when you're looking at the concept of democracy in the Middle East. I think that in Bush and his people were very naive in stating that, once we liberate Iraq, the people will be welcoming us on the street and everything will be fine. We'll help them with democracy. Democracy is something which is much more complex. It's not just a matter of having open and free elections. That was Germany in the 1930s. I hate to bring up Germany, but I think we have to do it as Europeans. You can have the form of democracy, but if the value system and the culture of the nation does not have the preconditions for a democratic state, you can impose elections. If you want to do it in, I think Egypt is a good example. You may get the most terrible anti-democratic regime in place. And it may be this notion of, democracy being free election once, and that's it. So I think that what is needed both in Brussels and Washington is a more realistic outlook on, what is really in the interest of the international community, of the Egyptian people. It's completely fair to say that Egypt as a nation is not mature for democracy. And you have to ask the question very differently. What is the least bad of two bad solutions? And I think the least bad thing in this is what they have right now. It's basically a military regime, but the alternative is not there for the moment. And I think it may take a generation, 2 generations to bring Egypt to the place where Europe is today. And one of the preconditions, of course, is literacy. How do you expect people to go and vote if they can't read and write? And so I think, what we need is much more of a realpolitik in Washington and Brussels. And to understand that it's not the end of the world if you have a regime in place which is not similar to Sweden or Holland. We're not quite there yet, and we just have to tolerate it and work on something which is more sustainable.
But when it comes down to European policy, that's certainly of Baroness Ashton's approach to the whole crisis in Egypt. One is that when President Mubarak, the former president of Egypt, was locked up and he was in jail by the Muslim Brotherhood, Baroness Ashton didn't visit her. But now that Morsi is in prison, she's visited him. What does that say to the Egyptian people? Because that can be interpreted as saying that the EU and the United States are supporting Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and understanding that Muslim Brotherhood are the godfather of international terrorism. They spun Al-Qaeda and Hamas, and really showing that Europe is actually on the side of dangerous Islamist extremists rather than the side of democracy and liberty.
I think it's been a very consistent policy of President Obama. When he gave his speech in Cairo just after his first election, he opened a Pandora's box. And now we are living with the realities of that open box. It's confusion, it's chaos, and there's no consistent policy from Washington in that regards. And it is, I agree, it is sending the wrong signals to those in Egypt who really wants reforms, who wants to promote democracy. But I think we have to state the obvious. I heard it several times in New York 2 weeks ago. One very prominent European foreign minister, he said it clearly. He said we have to bring political Islam into the democratic process. That means, and especially the Muslim Brotherhood, it has many backers in influential European capitals. And again, I don't think that there's a clear understanding of what is it actually that we are dealing with. But the perception here in Europe is that these are people that we have to bring in to the political process at any cost. And I think it's very again, counterproductive policy.
And Andrew, we're down to the last 2 minutes of the programme. But when we look at Egypt, and let's understand that the Egyptian Christians have faced their own Krishtonat back in August of this year, in which over 70 churches, monasteries church buildings have been destroyed, demolished and attacked, and Christians are facing incredible persecution in the Middle East. Why is there so much silence and no condemnation really from the international community when it comes to the plight of the indigenous people of the Middle East who are the Christians?
Yeah, well, I think this is a very important point, Simon. We are fortunately seeing a little bit of a change in that. I think Amnesty International came out with a report just last week bringing up this very issue of the persecution of the Christians. But to my mind, this is the real litmus test of any of these regimes, is the way they deal with their minority groups. It's the test of any regime, I think, of true democracy. Do you respect the rights, the freedom of religion, particularly of your minority groups? So it's the Christians who are in the front line, but let's not forget it was the Jews also 40, 50 years ago who were in the front line in the Middle East. Now it's the Christians, and there's nothing left. So we really are facing, as you say, this is a region which, in its origin, was made up of many ethnic and religious diversity. Christians and Jews and others were able to live there in freedom. And now we're seeing a world which we have sponsored and which we have participated in, which is completely destroying every ethnic, religious minority group. And to my mind, this is, we can't tolerate this kind of mentality on our doorstep.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you so much for joining me on this edition of the European Report.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of our viewers for watching this programme, and thank you for watching this programme, particularly because we've discussed so many issues that are affecting Europe, and let's do all that we can to protect religious and the practice of religious freedoms across the European Union. And thank you for watching this programme here from the heart of Europe in the European Parliament.